Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to DDA's Employment First webinar. My name is Stacy Jones, and I am the statewide Career and Employment Services Coordinator with DDA. Today's webinar is being presented in collaboration with our partners at the Division of Rehabilitation Services, or DORS. But before I introduce my co-presenters and our content today, let me walk through some housekeeping for the webinar. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. It will eventually be uploaded to the DDA webinar, archived webinar page on our website, so you can view it again or share it with other people. All participants are in listen-only mode, so in case you have audio problems, there's two different options for listening into the webinar. So if you have a problem with your computer, you can always call in via the telephone and vice versa. However, you have to remember to, if you're on your computer and on your phone, you're gonna have to mute your computer so that you can hear. There is a copy of this slide deck in the handout section of your control panel on the right-hand side that you can download. If for some reason you have trouble downloading it or you don't have time to download it, it will also be emailed to everyone that registered for today's webinar so that you can have copies of that. Throughout the webinar, you can type questions into the question box, which again is located on the right-hand side of your panel. I'm going to be taking a look at the questions throughout the webinar, but we will have a question and answer period at the end, so we may not get to all the questions throughout because we want to make sure we get through our presenters. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I have the pleasure of introducing one of our co-presenters on this webinar today, Jill Pierce, the Staff Specialist of Transitioning and Supported Employment with the Maryland State Department of Education's Division of Rehab Services. And I'm going to pass things over to Jill, and she's going to walk us through the agenda for today's webinar.
Thank you, Stacy, and good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to take us through a brief overview of what we're going to be going over this morning. We are going to start off, as always, we want everyone to be aware of the history of DORS and DDA collaboration and as how we're moving forward. So we'll start with 2018 to kind of give you all some updates on what we've done and what we've most recently done as well. And then we're also going to be going over specific examples of funding sequencing of how providers have been able to access both DORS and DDA for their consumers that are seeking competitive integrated employment. So I'll introduce our providers as we get closer to that, but we will have an example of the transitioning youth individual as well as an example for funding sequencing for an adult. We'll also be going over the next steps as far as general collaboration between DDA and DORS. And there will always be next steps as we're always continuing to work on improving efforts in supporting individuals through both of our agencies. So as a reminder, this will be a high-level webinar as far as we are continuing to work on some of the specifics to better support the field. And then, of course, we will end off with questions, giving you all the opportunity to ask any questions that may have come up during the webinar. And as Stacy noted, if you have questions, just to make sure you don't forget them throughout the webinar, you are welcome to plug those into the chat box. Other than that, I will start with a quick history. So starting back in 2018, we actually started earlier in the beginning of the year prior to updating the agreement between DORS and DDA with a provider work group. And it started off with about 6 to 7 providers from across the state where it was providers as well as DDA staff and DORS staff that would get together and just go through how things are going in the field, how DORS and DDA are working together in the field, how we can improve that, and kind of taking a lot of that information to help us, to help both agencies update the MOU to make sure it was a working MOU that made sense for the field, and that could also address any gaps or concerns in our collaboration. This is an ongoing group, which we'll also talk about when we talk about the updates for 2009. But it's been great because we've also been able to get a nice field perspective of what works and what doesn't when serving individuals. And then moving up in 2018, the updated agreement between DORS and DDA was signed on June 21st, 2018, and that it is a working MOU, and that outlines the roles and responsibilities of both partners, focusing on employment first efforts and really supporting this population on the pursuit of competitive integrated employment. And it is available on DDA's website. If you're interested for some late night reading, it is up for the public to view. Then we also, one thing we committed to in the MOU was joint trainings between DDA and DORS. So we started that off with a joint webinar in 2018. It was a general webinar, really just unleashing the updates of our collaboration between both agencies and introducing the working MOU to all interested parties. So that was the first of our joint webinars after that commitment. And then once we had the joint webinar, we also moved on to regional stakeholder meetings. So there were 4 regional meetings across the state with all partners invited. So it was DORS staff, DDA staff, school staff, the provider community, where we really went through our collaborative efforts on a localized area to better address the working MOU and how we could support individuals working together. And then we also have the State Employment Leadership Network. This is an annual meeting, and back in 2018, I think it was the first time DORS had also participated, which DDA had been participating in. But this is a federal meeting, our meeting with our federal partners, our federal Rehab Services Administration, as well as Medicaid services, where they provide a lot of helpful information to help us on the state level. So DORS and DDA were both, moving forward, committed to attending this to support the field as well. And lastly, in 2018, we started with the MOU the commitment of quarterly leadership meetings. So those are meetings between the DORS Assistant State Superintendent as well as the head of DDA, so that they are getting together now on a quarterly basis and have been since 2018 to continue to support this collaborative efforts.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So that takes us up to 2019. That was quite a lot that we did in 2018. So in 2019, we kept that momentum going. We started off the year by collaborating on the development of a checklist around competitive integrated employment. And the reason we did that is because really both of our agencies have competitive integrated employment as a desired outcome for employment services. So we created a checklist as well as some guidance. We did some joint webinars related to the subject back in the spring, and definitely the DDA webinar is available on our website in case anybody wants to go back and look at that. In June of this year, DORS and DDA held our first full day staff development day for our staff. So that included DORS field counselors, supervisors, state leadership, as well as DDA regional office staff, directors, headquarters staff, and our state leadership, all in the same room for an entire day. We really spent the day making sure that both entities have a good understanding and basic working knowledge about how the other entity works. We really wanted to start with basics. So that meant literally having a DORS 101 session for the DDA staff in the room, and then a DDA 101 session for the DORS staff in the room. And this made sure that everybody's speaking the same language, that really there's no assumptions about how the other agencies work, and we were kind of able to get everybody on the same page. We also used the day to kind of identify gaps that exist. So, really taking back, just like we did with our provider group and when we did our listening sessions that Jill referenced, we just asked what's working and not working. And we were happy to say that it was the same list that we heard from providers. So there wasn't it wasn't like we got a whole other list of things. So we kind of knew what are the things that need to be worked on. So these joint training opportunities, like the one I just referenced, is something that's going to continue, and our plan is to do several of those each year. We've continued our joint provider work group. This continues to give us an opportunity to work with those providers of both DORS and DDA funding to help walk through problems and gaps and identify best practices. Our two agencies have consistently held the quarterly leadership meetings that Jill referenced, and again, that allows our leadership to make sure that they're fully informed on this initiative, and to make sure that as we identify gaps, that we're able to talk through how we might close them. In September of this year, DDA and DORS, and as well as our partners at MSDE Education, all attended again the State Employment Leadership Network's annual meeting in Alexandria. And we represented Maryland as a state that participates in the State Employment Leadership Network. And many of you may be familiar with SELN because they are our partners that help us with our employment data outcome initiative. So that's for another day, but that's just another way that this ties in. And at that general meeting, we discuss, as Jill said, best practices, federal expectations related to collaborations around intellectual developmental disabilities agencies, education, and state VR agencies. And we continue to work with the SELN as we work on our joint guidance and policies, which we'll reference more as we get to the end of the webinar. And then finally, October of this year, we held the 2019 Employment First Summit, which was another opportunity for partners to hear from national subject matter experts on how to increase employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So all of these things we've continued to do in partnership, not only with DORS, but also with our other state partners that support individuals with disabilities. Okay, so one last thing before around collaboration in general. So you'll hear the theme of collaboration come up from beginning to end as we talk about DORS and DDA and supporting people around employment. But I just want to talk briefly in reference to actual job seekers. So many of you have most likely seen reference to the tool that's up on your screen right now. But for those of you that haven't, it's just one of a number of person-centered planning tools that have been developed through the Charting the Life Course initiative. And this one in particular is called the Integrated STAR. And it provides a visual of all the services and supports that could potentially be available to a person to reach whatever their individually identified goals are. So for instance, in the middle, it says person right in the middle of that star. And that person has something that they want to achieve in their lives. Now, obviously today we're talking about employment. So the assumption is that this person's, outcome is they want to get a job. But it's really a great place to start is to figure out what are all the things that a person has access to, always starting with the person's personal strengths and assets. What are the things that the person brings to the table, and really identifying what those are. But if you go around the integrated star, you see that that includes also relationships, eligibility specific services and supports, community-based services and supports, and technology. And the reason that I wanted to point out this integrated star before we move on to the rest of our webinar is just to remind people that DORS and DDA are one small part of a person's integrated star of supports and services and things that they have going for them. And so we don't want it to always be the only thing that's looked at when supporting a person around employment. There are other things that people in teams and coordinators of community services or CCSs can be supporting people with. So enough about that, but I just think it's a great visual. And another thing to keep in mind is if you are a person that's helping someone develop using a person-centered tool like this, you might find that some of these areas are blank or they don't have a lot in them. And that's sometimes also good information because it says that's where we need to do a little bit more work. So when you download a copy of this PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on the link that will take you to other examples and other person-centered planning tools related to this.
And now I am excited to introduce our guest presenters, as they've really been, leaders in the field. They've been out in the field doing the work, working, heading organizations that are working with consumers, and have been able to really come up with some best practices or some examples of individuals they worked with that they've been able to successfully access both systems to support them. So I'd like to introduce Tom Butner. He's the Director of Day Services at Community Living in Frederick, Maryland, and Cindy Freeman, the Executive Director at Spectrum Support in Owings Mills. And both Tom and Cindy, they've both been part of the joint DDA and DORS provider work group for over a year. And I think they've actually been since our very first meeting, and both of their organizations have provided both DDA and DORS funded services to people with disabilities. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Tom and Cindy.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us on the call, and thanks to Jill and Stacy for allowing us to be part of this also. I'll begin by speaking about supporting transitioning youth and giving an example of someone who we have recently supported who has been successful. And I'd say the thing of greatest importance is probably collaboration with all the stakeholders. So starting the transition process as early as possible. The person who I'll discuss in a second, we kind of came on a little bit later in the process, but it still worked out because of collaboration between all of the various stakeholders. And it begins with the schools, and then goes through DORS, DDA, the CCS, of course, the person's family, and potentially any other stakeholders that can come into the process. But it all really begins within the schools, and I believe the plan for the future is to begin this a lot earlier. I know we mentioned charting the life course, and it really, all of this begins at birth, as someone said at a recent presentation, but at minimum, hopefully it's beginning by age 14 in the schools to really be talking about what the next step is for people. And that means speaking with the student in the school system, as well as their family and other supports, and getting engagement from as many people as possible. And speaking about employment as the preferred outcome upon exiting the school system, and even if possible prior to that. So with possible work experiences, summer youth experiences, and really enabling the individual to connect with as many natural resources as possible. And then I'll give an example of a gentleman, Miles, who toured, and we were still having tours for our organization last year at this time. I think what we'd like to convert to gradually is less of tours of a facility and more of an informational interview where we get to know the person who will need supports, and they get to know us and the services and supports that we currently provide and what we are transitioning to being able to provide in the future under a slightly different model. So Miles was somebody who came and met with us at our facility. However, it was a discussion more about him and what he wanted. And we had decided to provide supports for him upon exiting the school. And this was in spring of 2018. He was enrolled in Frederick County Public Schools Success Program. And Success is the secondary transitional vocational program for students 18 to 21 years of age with disabilities. Frederick County has a great program, and we are trying to collaborate more and more with them. Several counties have very robust transition programs, and others are still evolving into becoming more supportive and having earlier relationships and earlier interaction with students. While enrolled in the Success Program, Miles benefited from a lot of different volunteer opportunities. The majority of them were at Frederick Memorial Hospital. And he had the opportunity to volunteer in several different departments with support of a job coach provided by Frederick County Public Schools. and established relationships, which was key in his future success. At the same time, he also applied for vocational rehabilitation services through DORS, was assigned a counselor who was very active. We're fortunate in Frederick County to have a great DORS office, and we benefit from being in I think a relatively smaller county. But I would encourage all of you to, have frequent conversations with your local DORS offices and get to know the various counselors and how each office may work a little bit differently depending on the size and how counselors are assigned, and really determining that and what works for you and your organization depending on where you are. At the same time, Miles is also assigned a CCS, Coordinator of Community Services, and applied for DDA services. And if we can move to the CCS, and here's a piece that was not probably ideal, however, it still worked. The CCS facilitated the development of Miles's person-centered plan prior to engaging a provider. And it's both good and bad. At the time, I think providers and providers still are in the process of transitioning to a different model. And so the plan should still be person-centered. However, the individual always evolves. We grow as people. The organizations that support individuals are also growing and transitioning. So an initial plan was developed based on all the information available. Miles, I believe, visited several different providers in the area and decided they would like to receive services from community living. And prior to exiting the school, Miles was actually offered employment at Frederick Memorial Hospital. And this was all based on the relationships that had been cultivated by the Success Program and by Miles in working in a variety of different departments. And he was able to obtain an offer for a paid job from an employer that typically offered volunteer opportunities to students. So this was a really unique situation where his relationships and his personality and the support that he had been provided by his family and through the school and a great job coach resulted in a job offer, which was fantastic. It was somewhat unexpected, and so DORS contacted us and asked if we would be able to assist in providing job coaching support for Miles from when he exited school, when he graduated in May, up until DDA funding became available. And if we can go to the next slide, Stacy, please. So ultimately, Miles actually began working as an environmental health service assistant as a substitute on April 23rd of 2018, and he was supported by a job coach provided by Frederick County Public Schools. And he was scheduled to graduate less than a month later, and that's where our DORS counselor, the local DORS counselor, contacted us to see how we could, help him transition in that process. So we had a team meeting, got everybody together. We learned a little bit more about Miles. We met his job coach. We went out to the job site prior to graduation, and everything had really been put in place by the job coach supporting him, who did a wonderful job. We met a variety of supervisors. Miles had 3 or 4 people who would regularly interact with him and help him be successful on the job. And we had a pretty seamless transition to that. And at the same time, we realized that his plan that had been submitted, his waiver packet and the services requested, would have to be amended because it did not include immediately rolling into what is currently supported employment funding. And we were fortunate also to have a really good relationship with the Western Maryland Regional Office of DDA, and the timing was a little tight. However, ultimately it worked out. Had had the DDA funding not been able to be approved, DORS would have continued their funding of a job coach beyond June 30th. So initially the plan was for DORS funding to cover the period from May 22nd through June 30th. And then the plan was to transition to DDA funding. However, had DDA funding not been available immediately on July 1st, DORS was committed to providing funds to support the ongoing job coaching, or the upfront job coaching that Miles still needed during the time that time period. And next slide, please. Sorry, Stacy. And so the process ideally really should always begin within the school system for the transitioning youth. It's doing the discovery, getting to know the students. Unfortunately, oftentimes the providers come into the process somewhat late at the very, very tail end. And unfortunately, I think sometimes valuable information is lost. So the sooner that we as providers can engage with students and the local schools, I think the greater the chances of success will be in the future. Having students engaged in community activities, whether they're volunteering or work experiences, is also key. And in the case of Miles, it really helped him establish the relationships that ultimately resulted in him being employed. But even if it doesn't result in employment, it sets the stage for expectations that students will have as they transition into the adult working world. And it is a very different world from what they're accustomed and what their families are accustomed to within the school system. And the earlier that stage can be set, the more likely they'll be successful. And then DORS also offers the pre-ETS programming to provide additional opportunities outside of schools, whether in the evenings or in the summertime, to expose students and help students learn the skills that they will need when they're transitioning as adults into the workplace.
Tom, may I ask a quick question that came through that might be a good time to ask it? Somebody wanted to know, did Miles have 3 different job coaches in 3 months? So can you clarify if that was 3 different job coaches or just different funding sources?
Sure. So while Miles was in the school system, he had a job coach provided by Frederick County Public Schools. And as we transitioned, we had a job coach provided by Community Living, so provided by the CRP, the provider, that shadowed the job coach and met with the job coach, and so had a little bit of a transition period, and then took over. That job coach then remained the same, and we actually provided, it was 2, if not 3 job coaches that got to know Miles. And I would encourage everybody always to have a backup. I would encourage you not to just rely on one job coach. If somebody needs, whether it's upfront or intensive long-term job coaching, it's good to have several people that work well with that individual, because people call out, and just bringing in a new person that has never met the employee previously is not ideal. So Miles got to know primarily 2 job coaches, and they remained consistent through the transition from DORS funding to DDA funding. So there was I had mentioned the piece where the plan had to be revised. And when we realized that, we thought there might be a long turnaround time. And I think because we had communicated this specific case to Western Maryland Regional Office, I'll thank Brenda Sparrow specifically in the office. She really made this happen very, very quickly. I know she needed some additional paperwork from me. I believe it was at the end of the week. I think it was maybe a Thursday or a Friday, leading into July, and ultimately the funding was available July 1st, and just really good communication. Again, it's the collaboration between the various offices of DORS, DDA, the schools, the family. Miles's family was amazing in supporting him, and a lot of his success should really be attributed to them. And but same job coaches for the process. And ultimately, the job coaching was stated shortly, probably by late July, beginning of August. Started the fading process. There were still some tasks that Miles. There were some concerns about Miles being completely independent. One of his tasks was to work the baler in the hospital, and he would fill the baler, but everybody really just wanted to make sure that he was safe. His employers wanted to make sure he was safe. His parents obviously wanted to be certain he was safe. Everybody involved wanted him to be safe, and it was establishing some natural supports and enabling him to, demonstrate that he could handle everything before the job coaching was faded out. Hopefully that answered that question. But I think and maybe move on to the next slide. And then Cindy, were you taking over at this point, or I can continue to speak as well?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Sure.
Good morning, everybody. So you guys just heard an example of how successful we can all be, when students are able to start accessing employment exploration when they're in school, and, everybody's working together and everybody's talking. So what I wanted to talk to you about now is just really, if you are a DDA provider who's not working with DORS, you really need to consider this, because anyone who's on this call, I know, must have some interest in employment. And as we all know, we need resources. And DORS is absolutely a resource that you can access that will make your programs better and give you opportunities that you would not otherwise have to build relationships. So Tom had already mentioned the pre-employment transition services options. That is a service that you do need to get a proposal into DORS. It is a program, but it is a great opportunity to actually make those connections with schools that you would not otherwise have, and again, to connect with the youth when they're still in school and when they're still fairly young, and you can introduce the jobs to them. The second opportunity is the work-based learning experiences. These are standalone funding opportunities. You really don't need to have the pre-ETS program. Spectrum actually used this last summer in Cumberland for the first time, and we were able to collaborate with both the local school system and the America Job Center out there to actually do job coaching for students, again, during the summer. And again, you get paid to support the kids at a community job site, and the pay is actually through the job center. So the student is paid, and really it's just a great opportunity for people. And then the youth extended services is funding that you can access for youth with disabilities that maybe either aren't eligible for DDA services, or they're not eligible right away. Maybe they graduated earlier and they need some long-term funding, and that's also a great funding opportunity for you to access. In the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about just thinking through some of your operations. When you're meeting with transition youth that are interested in coming into your program, and getting a job really quickly, you really need to look at where they are, what kind of experiences that they have actually had when they were in school, how their family and the individual feels about work, and what they really understand about work. Because if somebody is really ready to go to work immediately, you really want to get them connected to DORS during the summer months. As Tom mentioned, a lot of these kids are actually graduating in May, so you have 2 or 3 months before DDA funding is even able to kick in, and sometimes DDA funding doesn't even come until September. So you've got a number of months where the student is, disengaged at home. They want something to do, and you can actually use the DORS funding again to get them into a paid job before they even come into DDA services if they actually are ready. For others, of course, you may need to wait for the DDA funding so that you can actually do that discovery piece. And before we talk about that, I just wanted to, in case you're not familiar with the funding options that DORS has, you can actually access DORS for the job development prep, which are for things like resumes and interview skills, the actual job development hours, which is currently $47 an hour, and that can be used either with the youth, with the staff person, or if the job developer is just going out and contacting businesses by themselves. And then that short-term job coaching, if they need some intensive job coaching when they first start the job, again, $47 an hour. And if you're not in the DDA funding realm yet, you can actually do all of the supported job coaching through DORS in that summer month. And then, of course, benefits counseling. Even if you don't have staff yourself that are benefits counselors, that is absolutely a key connection that you really need to make if you're not familiar with it. Number of people that I've worked with in past years have stopped working or told employers that they couldn't work more than 10 hours if they didn't get that benefits counseling ahead of time, because they really just were scared they were going to lose benefits, and it's an understandable fear. But once they get the benefits counseling, they understand what they really can do, and it's factual as opposed to a lot of fear-based rumors. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the other transition youth. And what I mean by that is these are all the kids who we know exist who've had little or no work experience in school settings. Or maybe their work experience has been much more of an enclave situation where they might have been at a community employer, but they're with a teacher who is supporting people with 3 or 4 other students, so it's not a real work opportunity. So those students we really actually want to look at putting them into a discovery process once they get into DDA funding. These kids probably don't know if they want to go to work. They probably don't really understand what a job is. Their family might not believe that they actually can work, or at least not in an independent way, especially depending on how they were supported while they were in school. These are students that probably need to use the customized employment process, to not only discover what they're capable of doing, but to really make a good fit for a paid job opportunity for them. And my suggestion with this group is really to get them into work trials and volunteer opportunities in the community as early as possible, so we can actually discover how they're able to focus, in real life out in the community, again, with as little or as much support as they actually need, and building that profile so you can actually understand where to go to help them get a job. And then here's just our current options for how to support people in employment in the DDA funding side. You can, of course, use the CDS, and they have hours to do a lot of our discovery. The career exploration funding is a resource as well, but it is time limited. Supported employment, of course, is for people who do have a job for a certain number of hours. And that's how we, of course, support them with their ongoing needs and job coaching. And then in the future, when the funding kicks in, there will be discovery milestones and job development rates within DDA's funding resources. And then post-employment, again, we currently have support employment, but in the future, DDA will have a number of options: ongoing supports, follow-along supports, coworker employment and transportation that they're talking about funding, so that we will actually have, more resources that are specific, to hours that we need to help that person actually stay in a job and maybe even move into another one. And I believe we are going back to Tom at this point for another example as we transition into the adult world.
Actually, before we do that, I have a couple of, and thank you, Cindy and Tom, I have a couple of questions that have come in that just relate to youth. So before we move on to adults, I want to go through.
Okay.
And you both talked about pre-ETs and kind of from the provider side, putting in a proposal and how you provide those. Jill, would you be able to walk through for people who are not familiar how a student can get connected with pre-ETs, and just walk through a little bit what that is, because we had a few questions about that.
Okay, so how the student can actually get connected, or how
Yes.
the provider can. Okay, So the student, just like any other DORS funded program, you do have to have, if you have a program ready to go, you do have to have a vendor authorization from DORS to work with that student. And that's just that promise of payment for the service so that we make sure we can fund you to support the student. So typically the school system refers students directly to DORS. So we have, I think we're up to almost 6,000 students we're working with the number continuously growing every month. So we have a bulk of students on counselors' caseloads, and they refer them directly to DORS funded pre-employment transition services. So I know Tom and Cindy both talked a lot about that collaboration and relationship with the school system and DORS. So that's really important. Obviously, the more DORS knows about the programming, the better understanding they have and can support referrals to your program.
And Jill, just to clarify that if a student or a family wants to get connected with pre-ETS, they can do that referral as well, correct?
Yep, as soon as they are 14 and at least high school, they can connect with us. We accept referrals from outside other partners besides the school system, self-referrals, providers. It just typically happens to come from the school system.
And the pre-ETS is available only for in-school youth? So
only available for students with disabilities, but that also includes if you have someone who exited school earlier than 21 and they're a 19-year-old in college, they would also be able to access the program.
Thank you. And one more question. Work-based learning is through pre-ETS for DORS in our counties. Is that not true statewide?
No, so work-based learning experiences is one of the core pre-employment transition services, and it happens to be a standard service that we work with providers and partners across the state. I think there are some specific examples where it looks a little different based on different counties. So I think the reference was specifically in Frederick, or Cindy might correct me, want to correct me if I'm wrong. But that was a specific example of a work-based learning experience.
Ours is in Allegheny County.
Oh, Allegheny, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And just bear with me one second because I want to make sure I got all the questions that had to do with pre-ETS or youth. Here's just one more youth question. How can we get oh wait, we've got another one coming. Do you have resources for getting parents or individuals to know the importance of getting these funding opportunities before they leave school?
DORS does, we do have brochures and information for parents and families on our website, and I believe that link, we'll go over that link in one of the last couple slides. But we also, school systems are also supportive in providing information about additional resources. We also work closely, Parents Place of Maryland, that supports parents and families with helping them with things such as resources.
One last pre-ETS question. How can we get students with, I think this is behavior implementation plan, involved more with pre-ETS? I've had parents get turned down or put on a waiting list.
If they're a student with a disability, they qualify for pre-employment transition services regardless of the severity of the disability. Now, it could be a specific situation based on a partner we work with. Different partners develop different pre-employment programs, maybe for a specific population. We have one provider that their specialty is working with individuals on the spectrum. So their pre-employment transition services program, they're only working with students that are on the spectrum. So although DORS does not have those limitations, some of our partners implementing some of the programs may have specific limitations.
Thank you. And so, yeah, that's a great point. So again, if you're a DDA provider and you haven't gotten involved in pre-employment transition services, it sounds like there may be a need as far as that goes. All right, we're going to shift gears and I'll get you up on your next slide for adult services.
Okay, I'll pop back in again. This is Tom. So supporting adults in many ways, the things to consider are very similar. Again, it's collaboration. Typically, the adults have exited school a while ago, and so the school system may or may not be a resource. We were able to engage some educators for an adult that we support. However, I think that was probably more of an exception. We try to have what we call a circle of supports meeting, where we gather as many stakeholders together as possible. For some adults receiving services from DDA, they may or may not have a family involved in their lives. But it's, again, really important just to get as much collaboration as possible. Typically, DORS, DDA, CCS, various providers. So if somebody is in receiving residential services from one provider and meaningful day services from another, it's getting everybody to the same table and having a candid conversation about that person's skills, abilities, interests, personal attributes, work culture conditions, just environmental things that they prefer and don't like. And so we have attempted to have a pretty robust hour-and-a-half, 2-hour meeting to take people through that process and understand as a team what type of supports there are. And it's also determining if employment is something that this person is interested in. Obviously, employment should always be explored as the first preferred outcome, depending on many different factors: age, experience, just experience being a big one, what people have been exposed to in the past, what expectations have been set for the person, what their own goals are, as well as all those skills, interests, abilities, and how they contribute to making all of us who we are, right? We all have unique profiles, and it's finding good fits. For some people, if they're older, they may not be seeking employment anymore. And the new definition, or the definition we want to use, is retirement is really when somebody is 65 or older and doesn't want to work. You don't have to be retired. There are plenty of people who are working into their 70s, 80s. If you want to work, that should still be your first preferred outcome. And integrated community participation is so important in establishing natural supports, whether it's, being a regular participant in a church or another community organization where you have these relationships. Many of us are fortunate enough to have obtained our employment via people that we know and contacts. And so, unfortunately, for many adults in services, their support network is not very well developed, and they may have one family member and a handful of support staff that know them and that they interact with on a regular basis. And so it's really crucial in expanding that network of supports. Good. Sorry, Stacy. Next slide. Hello?
Did I get on the wrong? Am I on the right one?
Sorry, you are. I apologize.
Okay.
So again, I apologize. I was looking at my paperwork here at the same time. So the person-centered plan is really key in the process, and so the CCS for adults in services are a crucial part of this. They should not be the only part. And again, it's the team looking at the needs and then identifying outcomes for that individual based on their person-centered plan. And there are a variety of person-centered tools that were already touched on. And whatever, based on the individual, the team should be selecting one of or several of the many tools to kind of flesh out what is important for that person and how to identify focus areas of exploration that are meaningful, and then developing them in the plan. So that's kind of the basis for the team. So typically adults in services have already chosen a provider to help them reach their goals. And if an existing provider is unable to help that person move forward in achieving their goals and reaching their outcomes, a provider that may provide alternate services should be engaged. And we realize that within every geographical area, there are a limited number of providers providing existing services, and we all do so somewhat differently. But the CCS can really help to navigate that. And if one provider is unable to meet somebody's needs, then the team should recognize that and help the person move on to a different a provider and a different variety of services to really meet their individualized goals, their person-centered goals. Here's a story about Colleen, who is an adult that we support. And this is a 46-year-old woman in traditional facility-based services. She was 46 a year ago, and with a history of some work in enclave sheltered workshops, mostly at sub-minimum wage, throughout her life. We had not renewed our sub-minimum wage certificate, so we no longer offer that as even an option at our organization. I believe a number of providers still do have that, and it is a difficult thing to transition out of if adults have been able to at least receive a paycheck, even if it's been sub-minimum wage and not in competitive integrated employment. But I would encourage any remaining providers to try to make that move out of sub-minimum wage and away from enclaves and employment within your own organization. We have not completely done that yet. We do still employ some people for minimal hours, but we do pay them at least minimum wage. So Colleen had that as her background, and so her team, we had the benefit of being recipients of a TIP grant, and we're working with a consultant. We were working with Mark Wurzbacher of Wurzbacher and Associates, and we initiated a pilot project for some of the people that we supported in day services. We selected Colleen as a participant in that pilot, and she was one of the first people that we had go through that circle of supports process that I discussed previously. And just to touch on the circle of supports again, it's really trying to get everybody that supports that person, that knows that person and wants to be involved, and that person would like to have involved in discussing their goals, who they are, where they would like to be, either a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and it's getting to know them without speaking specifically about employment. It's really getting to know the person as a team and bringing in the variety of stakeholders. We did not have the benefit of doing that really with Miles prior to working with him. However, I would encourage you, even in looking at transitioning youth, just to take a quick step back, to try to engage early in the process, whether that's, at age 20, 17, or earlier. If a provider has an opportunity to get to know somebody and it makes sense as part of an intake process, I think it's a valuable tool. Our team just met with somebody in the Success program a week ago who is a transitioning youth scheduled to exit schools this coming May. And we held this meeting, and it was really, I think, beneficial, not only for us, but even for the educators, because there were family members there and a variety of people from our organization from different departments. And you learn so much about somebody, even if you've known them for many years, hearing other stakeholders share their experiences about who this person is, and listening to the person and listening to the people that know them best. So that's an incredibly important piece. So we did that for Colleen in the winter of 2018. And she then also applied through DORS for vocational rehab services. And we kept the collaboration going through additional follow-up meetings. Based on what we learned, we we had her attempt to do a variety of different work trials, primarily at employers with whom we had existing relationships. Ideally, you use the opportunity to establish new relationships based on what you learn from the person in their circle of supports meeting or the discovery process. It's a great time to try to establish new relationships based on the skills, interests, and abilities that are kind of fleshed out at that meeting. So DORS issued 8 hours for job development prep in May, and our job developer, Randy Kaiser, who is fantastic, and in the Western region, he's really kind of helped spearhead our regional community of practice for Employment First, which is an attempt for Western region providers to kind of collaborate and develop best practices and share struggles and successes and find a good path forward through our region. I would encourage you that do not yet have regional community of practices to do something similar. Back to Colleen, we identified, sorry, if you go next slide, please. Sorry, Stacy. Had, again, ongoing collaboration. There was some skepticism about Colleen's ability to be independent. Our job developer had gone and made some different contacts. Ultimately, Colleen interviewed at a local Wendy's. She did well in her interview process and was offered a job in late July. Still had to jump through a couple hoops, so she didn't actually begin working for a few more weeks. But initially, she was supported by a job coach funded by DORS. They provided, I believe it was 34 hours of job coaching initially for the upfront intensive period of her employment. And that then transitioned to DDA long-term supports. There is a fading schedule now, which dictates the number of upfront hours provided by DORS funding. And for the most part, it works. It can be extended if needed. For somebody only working a few hours a week, Colleen works three-hour days at Wendy's. And so the 34 hours up front were really sufficient. And then we provided some ongoing job coaching also for her and faded out. So she's now working independently, and we are about to assist her in being more independent and accessing Uber to get to and from her job also. Sorry, next slide. And again, for adults, discovery will be a DDA funded approach. I guess it's small d. Currently, we do discovery really through rehabilitation and CDS currently. And Cindy, were you taking over for this portion? I'm sorry.
I think so, yeah.
Can I just
Thank
jump
you,
in and
Tom.
can I say
Sure,
just one
Stacey.
quick thing, Tom?
Sure.
Discovery is currently also a funded approach. I just want to be clear in case you said it will be in the future. It already is. So people can receive DDA employment services currently to engage in discovery. And I think what you were referencing, Tom, is that the discrete service called Discovery is set to start next year. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Hi again. So what we want to talk about here is, for adults, as Tom has mentioned, who are already in DDA supports, you really have to approach this very differently. And I may repeat a little bit of what Tom said, but I think, as many times as you can hear it, there's so many barriers for people who have been in day programs or receiving sub-minimum wage types of employment and getting them into a competitive integrated job. And you really need to step back with the team first and address those barriers. Try to figure out, do they have family? If they have family, what are the family's fears? What is the individual afraid of? You know, what are they aware of what a job really is? Do they understand what work is? Do they have stamina? Because some of them actually you actually have to spend some time building stamina because they've been sitting in a program for 6 hours day after day after day, and you can't just take them out into the community, let alone get them in a job right away. You know, you have to look at the fear of losing benefits again, like I had mentioned before. Again, a lot of times exposure has not happened. If, again, they've been in a building, the same facility for many, many years, the first step can just be exposing them to different parts of the community to understand what they actually like to do, what kind of environment they like to be in, where can they be most successful. So discovery really is something you need to do with these individuals in a very creative way. It can absolutely be done, again, with the CDS and day funding because it does take time and it takes a lot of effort. And sometimes you really just have to, you're almost marketing employment to people who don't know what it is and to their families. And once you actually get people working, it will actually market itself because people, other people with disabilities will see that some of their friends have left the program and they're happy and they're working and they have money, and the parents of those kids will actually see sorry, I don't mean to call them kids, adults. The parents will actually see, you know, that's happening, and they'll talk to the other parents. So it's really more of an issue when you're starting to do the competitive integrated employment than it is years down the road. Because again, parents absolutely trust each other and begin to trust you once you actually are successful with other people. So where you want to actually bring DORS into the process is once you're ready to actually go into job development. It's not an obvious timeline. It's really something you just have to work through. But my recommendation is to engage them, you know, a couple months early, because there is some time in just getting that authorization from DORS. It's a tricky situation because you don't want to wait too long, because it does take a couple months to actually become eligible. But you don't want to go too early, because DORS is only going to work with you if you can get people jobs. That's their role. That's how they are measured. So if you just have people hanging out with a lot of authorizations, they're not going to continue to work with you, because it has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. So you want to bring DORS in again when you're ready to actually have that person go into the job development phase, because that's when you need them. And I think we're on slide 28, yeah. So, and again, this is really a repeat of what we had already talked about with transition youth on purpose. The same funding options are available for adults that have been with DDA for a long time as there are for transition youth. You can get the job development prep, you can get the job development hours, and you can get the short-term job coaching, because most of the individuals we support are not one-on-one funded. So the reason you would want to access DORS job coaching instead of the DDA funding is because you do need intensive one-on-one hours initially when you have somebody working at an employer. And so this is a way to actually pay for that staffing, you know, without jeopardizing the DDA funding. And again, this slide is also a repeat of what we had talked about with the transition youth on purpose, because again, the same strategies that you need to use when you have a transition youth that's coming out of school with little to no work experience, and or their family being hesitant to you know, get them into independent work, you want to use those same strategies with adults that have been in programming for a long time. And again, in the next slide, intentionally repeating same funding opportunities, you know, in terms of what we have available now and what we have available in the future. And I think one of the things that Tom was alluding to is currently discovery is something that we just, you know, are funding in terms of we have to do it within our current staff ratios and our current daily rates if we're using DDA funding. So you have to be creative and do discovery right now in a 1-to-4 relationship a lot of times. Whereas in the future, I think when the milestone payments come into play for DDA, there'll be other opportunities to maybe take people out in a one-on-one setting to do that discovery, because the funding will be very different. So I just really want to emphasize again how important it is to build relationships. You know, that's really the way the world works, in my opinion. Collaboration, relationships, trust. It takes time, and you have to be patient. You have to build trust with employers. You have to build trust with DORS. You have to build trust with DDA. You have to build trust with other nonprofits when you're doing volunteer work. And by the way, if you are starting to get into volunteer work, you have to treat that nonprofit volunteer job as a job, or you will fail, because they will not bring you back for volunteer opportunities if you are not respectful of their time and, you know, what they're trying to do with their business, because it's as important as it is a paid job. So kind of make sure you're treating that nonprofit volunteer site the same way you would an employer site. And the communication just has got to be consistent, open. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay for people to lose jobs. That happens in real life, but what's important is just to make sure, again, that the employers and the other agencies can trust you and trust that you're going to do what you say, and that anything that happens is really just a mistake and not anything but that. It's important, again, to do as much of this as possible in the community in an integrated setting. I have tried in the past to do some of the employment training in a building, have never found it to be overly successful because it just doesn't model the real world. So the more you can do, you know, with people in discovery in the community, the more likely you are to have them to get a real experience and to really see how they're going to do in a real job setting. Again, just you really, to build a successful employment program, in my opinion, you really have to look at lots of funding sources, lots of services, lots of supports, some of them unfunded, you know, because employment's important, but the funding is not all focused in the same place, and it's not all coming from the same people. And so you have to piece lots of things together to actually make it work, but it is doable. And just a reminder that people are going to lose jobs. They are going to want to lose jobs. They want to change jobs. And so you always want to be building that profile even after they get a job, to see if you can help them, you know, get a full-time job versus a part-time job, or more hours, or maybe they don't want to work in retail anymore and they want to move into something different. And so you never really stop building that profile with a person. You just need to keep you know, keep focused on that, because all of us grow, all of us change, including people with disabilities, and we should really never stop focusing on getting them that next career. And I believe I'm turning it over to either Stacy or Jill now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Tom. That was really wonderful. And as I expected, the theme of collaboration was one that was really woven all throughout that. None of these things happen perfectly. None of them happen exactly the same for each person. And so actually, I love the fact that, Cindy, you ended by saying, you know, it's okay to make mistakes. Things happen. People lose jobs. People want to lose jobs. And that we keep moving forward. So thank you. I appreciate both of you walking through a little bit about how your organizations have used both DORS and DDA funding to support employment outcomes. And we're going to get to questions in a few minutes, because a couple more questions have come in, but I wanted to just land a little bit on what are the next steps in the higher level state collaboration between DORS and DDA. We alluded to it several times throughout this webinar, but a critical partner in that collaboration is the Maryland State Department of Education. And we didn't go into a great deal of detail about that, but obviously as both Tom and Cindy and Jill talked about, it's critical to support students that are still in school around employment and transition. And Tom said it really early on that transition starts when children are little, not at 21, maybe not even at 14, but really as early as we can be talking about the importance of employment, and at the very least, raising expectations about what is possible for students and adults with disabilities around employment. So we work very closely with our partners at MSDE, and the quarterly leadership meetings that both Jill and I referenced at the beginning of the webinar. We are also, we're doing those quarterly leadership meetings to include our partners at MSDE so that we can make sure that all three of our agencies are communicating, that we have shared values, a shared vision, and that we're consistent in supporting youth and adults around employment. So that collaboration is one that's only going to continue and only continue to get stronger and more in depth. So we're going to also continue with our provider work group that, pardon me, that Jill and I talked about a little earlier, so that we can make sure that as we keep moving forward, that we're kind of validating with practitioners, so with providers that are actually doing the work to say, again, how is this working for you, and continue to dig down deeper into the guidance that provider organizations and people and families and stakeholders and CCSs need to better support people in getting those employment outcomes. We want to continue identifying what the gaps are. So Tom and Cindy talked a lot about kind of handoffs between various entities, handoffs between funding sources, communication with employers. Each of those things doesn't magically happen perfectly, excuse me. So we want to be able to figure out, are there systems issues that might be constraints for people accessing funding, and are there things that we can do to close those gaps, whether it's through guidance or it could be a training issue or some other gap. And as I said, we want to continue to work together to provide clear guidance around how to sequence funding between DORS and DDA, because that's an area that's, I would say, has been murky maybe in the past, and we want to make it as clear as possible. And we're continuing to do that, to work on those type of guidance issues. So more to come on that. Before we go to questions, I just want to also point out that if you need more specific information about DORS services, you know, this webinar wasn't sort of a deep dive about everything you need to know about DORS or DDA, but we do have resources on both websites where you can find out more information. So if you want to find out more about pre-ETS, I know for sure that there are pre-ETS fact sheets or more information about referrals to Division of Rehab Services or DORS services. You can go to their website and find that out. And likewise, if you want to find out more about DDA, Meaningful Day and Employment Services, you can do that by going to our website. And for those of you that don't know, many of you do because you're on this webinar, but we do have many resources related to Employment First, and we do have a number of recorded webinars that walk you through more of the specifics of DDA-funded employment services. So for those of you that may not be as familiar, I would recommend going back and watching those and looking for those resources. So I'm going to shift now to read through some of the questions that have come through. So if you'll just bear with me for 1 second while I pull them up and read through them. Pardon me. Okay. Recent research across the state suggests that DORS involvement with MSDE to prepare students for transition is uneven. Could you please talk about what you are doing more to improve DORS involvement and the quality of interaction during transition where it is needed? So I have thoughts on that, but I'll certainly let Jill jump in as well. As I referenced a few minutes ago, DORS and DDA have a very strong partnership with MSDE. to make sure that all partners that are working with youth are involved early, have the same communication, the same expectations. We all agree with the statement that you said that the interaction is critical during transition. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, Jill.
Right, the interaction is definitely critical, and I think it's a pretty general question. If you had any specific situations or scenarios, you're welcome to email me. As we work with, you know, all public school systems, non-public school systems, so across the state, there can be some differences just working with different school systems, different offices, different staffing in each area. But as a state as a whole, we are committed, as well as special education, are committed to working together to really support these students. The earlier, the better. As you know, with pre-employment transition services, we've been, we meaning DORS, have been promoting working with students and connecting with them as early as 14 now. So a lot of that goes with working with the school systems, educating them, so that they know we're available as a resource to refer their students to.
Thank you. I have a question. Who provides supported employment funding if a client is in self-direction? So assuming that that's referencing DDA supports or services. So if a person is self-directing their services and they have an employment outcome in their person-centered plan, they can access employment services through a DDA employment service provider. And if you need more information specifically about DDA services and employment services, like I said, you can go to our website and watch a number of webinars that will walk you through each of the services and how a person that self-directs can also access those services. We have another question. This has to do with self-employment. I understand that DORS RISE RFP for supported employment or for supported businesses may not be released for some time. Can you please clarify how people interested in self-employment will be supported in the meantime? I can't speak for DORS on that, but certainly if a person that's receiving DDA services is interested in self-employment, that would be something that could be explored either through our current supported employment service or in the future when our new services begin. We have a new dedicated service called Self-Employment Development Supports, which is a milestone payment for the development of a business plan and a marketing plan for a person that has identified that self-employment may be something they want to be involved in. And then ongoing job supports can be used to support a person that's self-employed. But Jill, do you have anything related to DORS and self-employment?
Unfortunately, my work with RISE and self-employment, my expertise is limited, but I can get contact information of an individual who'd be able to provide more information if you have questions. I don't know, Stacy, if I can share that, we can send it out, or?
Sure. Yep, we can send it out to everybody that's registered for this webinar. We have a question about, are all referrals for benefits counseling through DORS? So I know that DORS is a fairly big provider of benefits counseling. Centers for Independent Living also provide benefits counseling services. And I also want to reference, we did a webinar, gosh, it's probably earlier on in this year. So if you go to the DDA website, we have an archived webinar page, and we did a full-length webinar just on benefits counseling from a benefits counselor from one of our centers for independent living. So that might be a good resource if you'd like to find out more about that and how to access those services. If DORS requests are delayed, can we back bill for DORS job development activities?
Could you say that again?
They wanted to know if they can back bill for job development activities. So I'm assuming that means that the person, the job developer, is doing some activities of job development before they've gotten the approval from DORS.
No, and that's that authorization, that vendor authorization. That's the date that you've been authorized to provide services on. but I wouldn't move forward with the expectation that you'd be billed. You could bill for anything that you have no confirmation that there's prior approval through DORS.
Thank you. In 2020, will discovery be something that can be repeated, or is it once in a lifetime event? So to answer your question, DDA's service called Discovery that's available through our waiver starting in after July of 2020, yes, a person can receive that service more than once. We would authorize it once every 2 years. If there's some extenuating circumstance, like the person's had a life change that would impact the results of the original discovery, we may authorize that on a case-by-case basis. But yes, a person can get the service more than once, but just not more than once within 2 years. Let's see if my daughter is in 11th grade at a non-public placement school with an 11-month program. She has half days in the summer. Would pre-ETS programming be good for her after school in the summer?
Definitely, depending on what's available in the area of the state she lives in, I'd recommend getting in contact with your local DORS office to start working with them and seeing what pre-employment transition services programs are available that might support her.
Thank you. And actually, I really like this next question. How can a day or supported employment provider grow the opportunities for the individuals in these programs? And I'd like to maybe throw that back to Tom or Cindy to get their thoughts on that. So if there are current providers that want to expand opportunities for people they're supporting, do you all have thoughts on where to start?
I'll speak for community living really quickly. I think we would like to expand the services that we support. So our most recent cooperative agreement with DORS was from this past summer. I believe it was signed in July. And, you know, again, I think the collaboration is important. I also think at the moment there's so many competing efforts. I think we're in attempting to transition and better understand the new variety of employment services with DDA. I think we're trying to continue to support people in line with current guidelines and current expectations, while being pretty fluid and trying some new things. So I mentioned that we went and met with somebody still in school, which for us is completely new, and making that probably part of our intake process is beneficial. However, it's not funded. So we had 2 directors, a job developer, and a program manager spending a couple hours the other day with a student for whom we're not receiving any funding and may not receive any funding in the future. I think we would certainly like to explore other funding options and other service options that would benefit people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And I think we'd also like to expand. Cindy mentioned earlier that existing CRPs and providers, maybe not even set up with DORS yet, have the opportunity to access different funding streams that are all related to employment. And I believe the connections, the relationships that would foster would benefit all of us. I also mentioned a community of practice earlier. I think we can learn from one another, learn what's working for some providers, what's not working for some, and develop together, you know, ways that we can work within a model that is changing. And I imagine, and maybe Stacy and Jill can comment on this, but I imagine there still will be some changes to the collaboration between DDA and DORS. And I think even the rates at which different services will be paid to providers and CRPs will still change. And so it's a discussion about providing appropriate services to the people who need them, but also remaining sustainable as organizations and not spreading ourselves too thin, and then not being able to do things well.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's fair.
And I just want to add, like, even though this is Cindy again, I'm not new to employment myself. Spectrum actually has not been in the employment world. And so when I came into Spectrum a year and a half ago, one of my main tasks is actually to try to develop employment for Spectrum. And so we've actually been working for the past year with a consultant to actually develop a plan. So I'm kind of doing this myself right now. It's not easy. We are trying to figure out where to start and what resources to put in first. Job development is definitely one of my recommendations and something we're looking at because I truly believe if you don't start connecting with nonprofits for volunteer opportunities and employers, you're really not going to get anywhere. You really need to access different funding sources, not just DDA. DORS does have the DORS only opportunities, which, in my opinion is part of the plan, just because otherwise you're not probably going to have enough funding to actually support your programming. So I think there's all different kinds of ways, and some of it depends on how your agency is set up now, and you really do have to look at how the departments interact, how many people are working versus not. Are you going to continue to have a separate support employment department versus merging it all together? Employment, in my opinion, cannot be done as a side note. It has to really be focused on by somebody, or else it's not going to happen. So, regardless of how you set it up, you have to have somebody in your agency that's really invested in making it happen. And I think on top of that, in making sure the funding follows, because if you're not focused on the funding, you can't. I don't think you can rely just on DDA, to get that funding, even in the future with the rates changing. I think you really have to look at different types of supports.
Thank you. And actually, this next question, I think you kind of touched on some of the answers to it, but I want to just read it to get your thoughts. With both community development services and community integrated employment services happening at the same time, how do other agencies manage to have adequate staff to cover both? CDS is a door-to-door service that's supposed to be 6 hours, which takes staff away from providing job coaching services. When you have several participants working in the community, it's difficult to cover both at the same time. Do other agencies have different staff who only work in CDS and have separate staff who do just job coaching? So I think you started to kind of allude to that, Cindy, of really kind of building out your employment services, but do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's the same answer, really. You have to have people cross-trained to do all of everything, and everyone can't do employment. I don't mean to suggest that you have every direct support staff person trained to be a job coach, but as Tom mentioned in, I think it was Miles' story, you have to have 2 or 3 people who are familiar with somebody who's working, who can step in and back up, to job coach, just because people do call out and things happen. Sometimes employers call you last minute and say, hey, like, this person's going to get fired if you don't get somebody over here. So I think you have to have staff, number one, who buy in, staff who are professional enough to be in the community, alone, where they're not always being supervised by somebody. And, again, like, you can't, yes, there are some overlapping times, but employment does not happen Monday through Friday. CDS generally does. So you have to have staff that are willing to work evenings and weekends, including your management, because I know that's a struggle sometimes when people are transitioning from, just running a day program. They have to understand that there are absolutely times where they're going to have to, personally be involved on the evenings and weekends, or else they can't run an employment program. But there isn't an answer to your question, really, except you just have to be creative and figure it out.
Thank you. And you sort of alluded to this as well, but I would also add, providing employment supports, whether it's discovery or job development or even job coaching, you want to make sure that your staff have the proper training. So just relying on staff that you may already have who may not have had that level of training yet. Not that you can't provide that level of training, you definitely can. And there definitely are existing staff that may be doing day hab and CDS that would make excellent employment staff, but you also want to make sure that they have that training, because there is a different skill set, and there are different, kind of requirements and focus. So that's, I think, important when you're dealing with that as well. I think
Tom is using personal support, so I don't know if you want to mention that, because that might help people.
So community living is fortunate that we provide a variety of supports right now: residential, personal supports, meaningful day services, including CDS, supported employment, and day habilitation. And as we transition to the new waivered services that would be fee-for-service and hourly as opposed to daily, we will probably need to discuss new ways to kind of braid our internal supports based on somebody's needs, and look at different ways to use a combination of personal supports, the variety of employment services, day habilitation, and/or CDS to support people 7 days a week at all hours. So meaningful day could be meaningful day from any time that person is not sleeping. So, if employment can happen at any time, and it could be that somebody's working an overnight shift. And again, one of the challenges converting to the new waivered services will be when everything is clearly defined, and then seeing we want to support the people that we're currently supporting, and then be able to support new people as well based on their needs and based on their goals, their person-centered plan, and looking at the arsenal of different supports and funding that can be utilized. So I think providers need to look at their own structure based on what they currently do, based on their mission, what they are now and what they want to become. And I think many providers will have to do at least some level of restructuring and combining supports differently to meet the needs of the people that we serve and support. So I think personal supports, back to Miles. Miles also receives personal supports from us, which is beneficial to him. Under the current structure, we receive supported employment funding. Under the new structure of new waivered services, when they go into place, he will most likely transition to employment services, follow along supports, which will be a reduction in funding that we receive as a traditional day services provider. However, Miles's needs will still be met. And looking at the individual and then combining all of the services and supports. And I'll be the first to admit that I am not yet well versed enough on all of the new waiver services. And to be honest, I'm not probably well versed enough on all the existing funding opportunities that we could have access to. So back to the collaboration piece, it's being involved in ongoing conversations with the various agencies, from education, DORS, DDA, and having kind of candid and open, transparent discussions about what the challenges are. Ultimately, I believe we all do want to support the people with developmental and intellectual disabilities collaboratively from birth until death. Our organization supports somebody who just turned 95. Our current structure has been really 21 and older. Through Weebles, we recently supported some 3 17-year-olds through DORS funding, which was new for us. And I think we will continue to look at options and hopefully the variety of providers across the state. I think for most of us, our mission revolves around providing those supports to people with disabilities at a minimum, and then other people beyond that. I think expanding employment services may be a good option for some providers to go beyond that, beyond just people with intellectual developmental disabilities to just general disabilities, or even other at-risk groups requiring employment services. And I think Cindy alluded to that a little bit earlier. So really having a good understanding of the supports and the funding that's out there, And it is an evolving process. And that's why this conversation is so important. And the collaboration between DORS and DDA and MSDE is so important. And having a seat at the table, if you're not already involved in a community of practice, if your organization doesn't regularly engage in conversations with other providers and funders in trying to find creative solutions, you might be at a disadvantage. I think it is so important, and we're fortunate to have our leadership. Our CEO is fantastic about being engaged, and I think it's helped our organization at least understand to some degree what's out there. And it's a challenge, and I appreciate everybody's effort in helping to educate and re-educate me in the changing landscape. And I think recognizing that the landscape is changing is so important, and being part of the conversation as to how to address the needs within our state is crucial. So again, I think Stacy and Jill have been extremely helpful in this process for me personally. And I think having a seat at the table and being able just to remain engaged is so very important as we go, through statewide transformation, specifically the employment piece.
Thank you, Tom. I couldn't have said it better myself. We're at the end of our time, but I just want to echo Tom's sentiments here that this is an evolution that's going to continue. Jill mentioned the fact that our memorandum of understanding between our two organizations is a working document. So as we are able to find more clarity, as we're able to identify gaps and close them, we will fold those things in as necessary. So you see on our screen, we have email addresses for both Cindy, Tom, myself, and Jill. If you have questions that did not get answered, or you have questions that you think of later, please feel free to reach out to us. My only ask is, if you send a question that has to do with both the DDA and DORS, send it to both Jill and myself, because that does help us be able to give better guidance when we're both able to respond equally. So thank you again to Tom and Cindy for sharing their organization's journey around employment. Thank you to Jill for your partnership and your partnership with DORS. And I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. Have a great weekend, happy Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you soon.